Alrighty. Hey Oscar, hey Amaya, how's it going?
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Super
Excited to be here.
excited. Yeah, I'm really pumped for this episode. So it is currently Monday, November 2nd. It's 10:08 a.m. here in Los Angeles. We're all over the world though. So I'm gonna have the two of you introduce yourselves. And yeah, say your SMR, Sun Moon Rising, if you're comfortable with that. Tell us a little bit about your practice, and yeah, we'll start with that. So Amaya, why don't you start?
Sure. So I'm Amaya Rourke. I am located in Ireland. It's actually 6:08 over here in the evening. And gosh, I don't even know where to start with my practice really, but my sun moon rising is Aquarius, Cancer, Scorpio. And I think for Oscar and I, knowing what your heliacal rising stars are important too. So I believe that one of mine is Acumens and the other one is
Mm.
Fosse's. With
Mm.
some fierce ass stars and then algal everywhere. So um, as far as how I got started in fixed stars, it was kind of interesting. I started reading through some of these ancient texts when I was starting to relearn traditional astrology, and they would make these kind of sideways comments about fixed stars. And that got me way more interested because I was like, knowing a little bit about history, it didn't start with planets. They thought the planets were stars. And that's what kind of led me down this road. Also, I really love that during the whole year, I can go out and there's something new to look at in the sky. And you don't get that necessarily with just using the seven classical planets. It's the same planets in different places. So it was really satisfying to be able to take that to a different level where I could actually walk outside and see the astrology year round. And I started off with Brady's books and then got more books because I'm a book addict. And then I realized that I wasn't quite understanding it. And I'm sure that most people who learn the fixed star stuff probably experience the same thing. So I went and got Brady's lectures. And here we are today. I use them in my practice mostly for natal readings.
Awesome. And yes, I had a lovely reading with you and learned a lot about my parents. So yeah,
Yeah, I
thanks.
really enjoyed it. It was so much fun.
It was really fun. And Oscar, how about you?
Yeah, my name is Oscar Moises Diaz. I'm a practicing astrologer full time now. I, you know, I'm located in Charlotte, North Carolina right now. But I have really deep ties to Boston and also, Queens, New York. So want to rep all three. And yeah, and I was born in El Salvador in Central America. And yeah, my practice. I do natal readings. I also do like, parans as like a second tier reading. I do studio visits where like we combine astrology and someone's creative practice, and we really try to like build a session around that. And yeah, I work a lot with like artists, poets, filmmakers. So there's like something really artistic about like how I approach astrology and in the sessions. And yeah, I don't know. My sun moon
SMR,
rising.
yeah.
Yeah, Capricorn sun, Aquarius rising, Taurus moon. And then yeah, it's a fixed star episode. So, I it's yeah, I totally agree. We have to add in the heliacals. My heliacal rising star is Oculaeus. It's a stinger twin star in the Scorpio constellation. And then my heliacal setting star is Capella. So yeah, that's
Awesome.
the
Yeah.
vibe.
So you
I
have
believe
Aculeus and I have Acumen, and they go
Hmm.
together. How
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, I once we kind of get further in the episode, I have a really cool story about my family lineage and the Scorpio constellation and our
oh,
Oh, cool.
hometown. So yeah,
I'm
I mean,
excited.
I'm excited. Yeah.
That's one of the
I
things that I've recently been getting into is more of like the Central South American side of the fixed stars because they have their own cosmology, but it's interesting how it maps over. And I always find it fascinating that they came up with the same method
Yeah.
as what the Egyptians did. So it's
wow.
it's a rabbit hole that keeps going around the world, which is awesome.
Yeah. I believe my heliacal rising is Spica. I don't really know about any of the any of the other ones, which is sad because I did get a reading from you. I got a reading from Irina recently, and they told me a bunch about fixed stars too. And I like it's so
It's a lot.
it's a
A
lot,
lot,
and
yeah.
I guess I want to like start out by letting people know I don't know much of anything about fixed stars, and so this is like really informative for me, as I'm sure a lot of listeners are going to be learning a lot as I'm learning a lot. So just so you know, this is like a topic I have no sense of expert in whatsoever. And I believe that Chris Brennan is going to be doing a fixed star episode on his podcast, the astrology podcast. So I think that's going to be really cool to kind of have both of our episodes
Nice.
out there. And yeah, like multiple different perspectives on fixed stars. It makes me think like, I wonder what Twitter is going to be like after both of these episodes are out. Everyone
Very excited.
about
Very
their
excited.
fixed
Yeah.
stars. Yeah, it's exciting. I'm currently wearing some fixed star materia, some Aldebaran and a little Regulus, because, you know, why not? Fixed star episode. But yeah, before we get started, let's talk a little bit. I mean, I don't think we all don't really know each other that well, right? So I just met you today, Oscar, over Zoom before we started this. But I've known of you through Twitter. And that's how, you know, I found out that you were into fixed stars and parents. And then Amaya, same with you. We have never met in person, but we know each other through Twitter, right? And I think at the beginning of quarantine, it was when a lot of astrologers were getting together to just like nerd out over astrology on Zoom. And I think that's where I met you for the first time.
Yeah, if I remember right. I think I like demanded that Gabe open up a room because he had told me we were going to have one and then he was going to not do it. And I was like, I did not get dolled up for you to not open this room. So, and then you showed up and you'd been in a Zoom party. And so you were just vibing.
That's me. I'm always talking to astrologers in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, so happy to, you know, have met both of you and to have you both here. And I don't think you two know each other, right?
We know each other from Twitter.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the fixed star thing kind of blew up in the last couple of months. And so that's when I think like I posted some stuff and then some people reblogged it. And then I started to find like the people on Twitter who were actively talking about it and who it was part of their practice. And I was like, oh, okay. So like, because like you do all the Brady stuff and then, I mean, just the nature of fixed star work, it's just, I think about like if you were to go back like 2,000 years and tell an astrologer like, in 2020 people really see fixed stars as like esoterica or just kind of like this extra stuff, they'd be like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's kind of lonely, if someone says params, I'm gonna be like, oh, and so I just followed a bunch of people and like, yeah, just it's nice to be in conversation in the Twitter sphere, and I've like learned a lot, and like the stars will teach me through the people, right? And so as astrologers, we know that like we get better by being in conversation, whether that's like amongst each other or even just like through a client astrologer relationship, like, and that's where I feel like I learn most about the stars are in consultations by people like living and breathing these starlights inside them. And so yeah, really appreciated following Amaya's work online.
Awesome.
Well, I'm really honored because I feel like Oscar, between the two of us, you're much more technically adept. I take a little bit of a different perspective, being primarily an animist and I guess, for lack of a better word, witchy. I'm in constant conversation with the stars. I do astrological magic. I make my own materia. In fact, I was just going to say I'm wearing some Regulus and Alcade right now. And it's interesting because I think that it'll be a good conversation because we've never actually spoken other than some retweets and some comments here and there. So it's fun because literally I don't know one else who does parents. No one. So it's nice to have someone you can have an actual conversation with.
Totally.
Yay.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be the one who's like the noob asking a ton of questions.
That's good though, because you know what? We'll think that something is common sense and it probably isn't.
Yeah. So let's start out by just defining some of these terms. Like, what are
Sure.
fixed stars? What are parens? Yeah. And whoever has thoughts about that can start off.
Do you want to talk about what fixed stars are, and I'll do the params or something, or
Yeah,
what
that
do you
sounds
feel
good.
like?
That sounds good to me.
And
So
we can
fixed
bounce off.
stars. Yeah, let's bounce off. Let's vibe. So fixed stars are essentially they're non-moving objects in the sky from our perspective. Uh, Mostly because they're so damn far away that if they are moving, it's not going to catch up to us for a very long time. We have this idea that they're rising and setting because of the Earth moving, not because the stars are literally moving. And the way that they were delineated was because what they called wandering stars were the planets. They were actually moving. And that's where we get this backdrop of these stars are fixed, these stars are not. And for a long time, they didn't realize they were planets. They were just wandering stars. So that's what we define fixed stars are they don't wander like the planets. And the only movement they have is really because the Earth is moving.
So that's basically like the constellations, or the fixed stars, correct?
Right. So the constellations are made up of individual stars, groups of them. And they're different in every country that you encounter them, though some seem to be consistent across multiple cultures, which is really cool.
That's awesome. Cool. And then, yeah, is it parents or parans, or is it?
I feel like it's just, especially
or?
when it comes to like American English, like we got so many different accents. I know sometimes I sound like a Bostonian, a New Yorker, or like a Charlottean. So I think it's just, parans, like whatever feels natural,
Okay.
Language is great because language is living, and language would die if it wasn't constantly morphing and changing. So I think whatever feels comfortable for people, they should just say,
Such
rock
a
it.
such a Mercury and Sag answer.
Yeah.
My Mercury and Sag really appreciates that.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah, why don't
Jupiter.
you define parens, parans for us.
Yeah, so parans are just kind of like, we kind of have to check our birth charts at the door for a second, and like, it's really simple. It's visual astrology. So it's really just like you go outside and you notice a star like Alresha, and you notice like Alresha is setting at the same time as Saturn is culminating. And so that's it. You've noticed a paran. Parans have orbs of like 2 civil minutes. Orbs for parans on the angles are like 4 minutes. It's like, we'll talk about that later, but like, yeah, put simply, like a paran is the simultaneous rising, crossing, setting of the meridian below or above of the stars and planets. So it's really just about like watching the sky in motion and like the different relationships that the stars are having. And it's like kind of like a very simple observation of the sky earth planet relations, and it's affected by like the observer's latitude, so they kind of resist being reduced
I would
to
say
like
it's kind of like a angular parallel is the way that I put it. It looks like it's in an angle, so it's either at 90 or 180 degrees, which is hard for us to conceive of because it's a 3-dimensional space rather than a 2-dimensional flat chart.
Can we do it like can we try to picture it like, we're standing out in the middle of the desert, let's say, and we look up and we see Saturn, because right now we can see both Saturn and Jupiter at night. So let's say we see Saturn up there in the sky, and that's what you mean when you say culminating. You mean like it's at the highest point before it starts to set towards the west. That's what you mean, right?
Yeah, like on its pivot points.
Okay.
So yeah, like rising, culmination, like
Right.
upper and lower culmination, and then like setting. So yeah, like descendant, right?
Right. So basically angular in a way,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, like medieval, Dr. Brady, who's my teacher, is like a hardcore like medieval astrologer too. So it's kind of, we do learn about like, thinking of that as like the cross of matter, like I guess like medieval astrology kind of language.
So let's say we
Very
see
much
Saturn,
so.
Saturn culminating and high up in the sky, and then we look out on the west at the western horizon. We see a fixed star, any of them. I don't know. We see a star. That right there is a paran, is what you're saying, because there's like the way, thinking about it astrologically, I know, it's all astrological, but thinking about it in terms that I think more astrology people that don't know fixed stars might know it's like we have Saturn close to the midheaven, we have the fixed star close to the descendant, right? And that right there would be a Perrin because they're they're squaring each other.
But it's a little bit different, and I think this is really important to note. The Egyptians did not stick to the ecliptic. They did believe in the heliacal rise and setting, which is about it being in the east or the west along the sun's pathway. But otherwise, they were looking at it like a giant umbrella. And that's why if you're a traditional astrologer, even a modern astrologer who's never used fixed stars, it can be very disorienting when you first start getting into this, because you could have a star that's culminating, but it's not technically at a midheaven as it would be defined on a normal chart. That's where it can be, again, it's completely different. And I think it's very important to make that distinction. It is not the same as our kind of, I feel like, flattened charts that come from, and I love traditional astrology. I am a traditional astrologer, but it is a flattened sky. It's like this narrow band. That's the ecliptic, but there's so much more. And that's what the Egyptians were looking at, was this umbrella. And Oscar did a great job of explaining it, because he's trying not to get too defined on what is the culmination point, because it's not a stuck on a chart kind of point.
And you know, there's different, you know, we collect the natal batches of stars, you know, from like a 24 period from sunrise to sunrise, and that's kind of like you know, the Egyptian Roman method. And then like there's also another method where, you know, the kind of like Babylonian way of like making the marking points like the sunset. But you know, just through Brady's work, we kind of adopt the Egyptian sunrise to sunrise method. So that's kind of like, you know, that's totally like not like birth chart thinking of like, you know, in the wheel. We're really like out like being watchers of the sky to collect the parans around a birth, you know.
I love that.
And so you know, it's the time of this joining between planet and star, and so it might happen later in the day of your birth, but you're like born into like that effect of like that time period when that like Earth planet sky relationship was happening. So it's kind of cool. And you kind of have to kind of just like shift your thinking a little bit around like the sky. And you know, what I found so exciting about fixed star work was that like, I can have a relationship with the sky that's like, you know, past the ecliptic, which is exciting. I think I was like,
especially since there's so much more of the sky to look at, and there's so many stars that, you know, if you're just going off the ecliptic, you're not going, plus even the stars that we project onto the ecliptic are not on the ecliptic. And I think that's really important, is what you're doing with traditional astrology when we look at conjunctions is we're projecting a star back onto the ecliptic along it's not the longitudinal lines, it's the latitudinal lines, if I remember right. But we're projecting it back on. And that means that we're not actually showing the true position of the star. We are projecting it onto a zodiac so that it's easier for us to conceive of. And I think that both methods are valid. I've seen it work in both methods. But it's important to know, like, if you're looking for that sky relationship where you can look up into the stars and see what's in the sky, you're not going to find, say, Vega in Capricorn. That's not where it exists, but that's where it exists when we project it onto the ecliptic. And that's what makes it exciting, is that we actually open up a huge door. In fact, I have my books next to me because I thought you might want suggestions for readers. And
Definitely.
Like this 2-volume monster set, which is expensive but totally worth it. 1,600 pages. Do you have this yet, Oscar?
I don't. Is this the book from Ukraine?
No, this is Diana Rosenberg's work.
Oh yeah, she's kind of one of Brady's only contemporaries. They kind of were, and they've been in conversation for, you know, over the years, and they disagree on certain things, but like both of them have really been in conversation throughout the decades of like really like fleshing out the stars and, you know, kind of like bringing them back. Oh my God, I didn't know.
Yeah, you ought to get it now. It's on eBay. You know, she died. She had cancer and she passed away. Rest in peace, Diana. But this was her swan song. This was her final work. Her family kept the self-published books, and they sell them on eBay. And they're almost out. There's you got to do that now because there's only like 25 copies left, and you get both volumes. But this right here is phenomenal because what she does is she arranges it both by tropical and sidereal, so you can use it either way. And she goes through, and not only does she detail so many stars, but then she gives you a billion both mundane and natal examples. I mean, like it's a giant casebook. So you can literally flip to like Taurus, look at all the stars that are close to that constellation or projected onto that constellation, and then see a billion different examples of how that might play out in a native's life, which I found very valuable because as someone who's got some pretty negative stars in my parens, I needed some outside perspective.
I love that. So I just want to, I'm trying my best to like, do this so that people listening, because it's such a visual really art form. So to try to paint a picture for folks. So when we're talking about like the ecliptic, for instance, what we mean is the path that the sun takes through the sky. And that path is where all the planets take, basically. and what I'm trying to say is that behind that path of the sun and all the planets is the zodiac belt. And that's a sequence of 12 different constellations that we know of, like the Aries constellation and the Taurus constellation. So that's the zodiac belt, but that's just like a very narrow band of sky that we're looking at, that the planets move through. But that's obviously that's not the totality of the stars in the sky. There's stars all over and outside of that band that the planets travel through. So when Oscar and Amaya are saying like that stars are projected onto the ecliptic, what that means is that there's this like way of basically looking at a star that's not within that band and sort of like drawing a line to like the closest place it would be on that band, that zodiac belt band. Does that make sense? Did I explain that kind of okay?
Yeah. And if we want to get like into some of the historical texts, there's an astrologer, we don't know their name, but they go by Anonymous of 379, and they kind of talk about like, they wrote about stars and parans, and like they kind of suggest that like it might only, this is their words, like it may only be acceptable to collapse stars onto the ecliptic if they were located close to it, but one should work with the parans for all other stars. So I mean, there were these conversations were like conversations that they were having like thousands of years ago of like, what to kind of do. But yeah, it is kind of like a narrow strip, and there's so much.
It's a very narrow strip. Yeah.
Cool. Well,
and I think it's important to note, like, even the zodiac that we have, the Egyptians had already kind of preemptively discovered what basically precession is. And precession is the Earth's tilt changing over time. So every 72 years, it looks like everything is rising 1 degree later than it is, because the Earth's tilt is constantly wobbling. And because of that, what the Egyptians had done, and this is fascinating to me because I made this connection in my own practice because of my astrological magic and stuff, is they had to constantly change their decans list. They created a calendar called the decans or the decans, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And we have so many different decans lists. I have, Austin Kopic's book, 36 Faces. And that was the nice connector to go in with the fixed star practice I already had, because he talks about how it was actually part of the tradition to constantly be updating this because they wanted to make sure they knew the exact time, because it was actually part of their religion. They believed that gods were basically attached to the stars that would helically rise and set, and that the gods would walk amongst us. And so that was very important to them. They felt that if you had like a circumpolar star, they did not care about you. And so when a god would walk amongst us from a star that had touched the horizon, that was a time to pray and propitiate to that god, because it would be more willing to hear you out. It had compassion because it could feel the plight. Actually, they said that he wounded his heel when he touched the earth. And we've actually got a star associated with that. So it's very important to note that they'd already discovered precession. Then the Greeks come in, they kind of borrowed the concept of a 12-part zodiac from the Babylonians. And they saw what the Egyptians were doing and they wanted to figure out how to incorporate it in. And so their excuse for making a fixed zodiac, because it's really important to know the constellations are not each a 30-degree, space in time. They're all different sizes. Like Cancer is tiny. It's only like 5 degrees. And then Libra
Virgo
is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're huge. You've got huge constellations, you have small constellations. It was conceptual from the very beginning because they knew that precession would change these guys and they wanted to fix it to something that was more dependable. To the Greeks, things that were predictable and symmetrical, they were holy. It was so important to them to have that. That's why they created the ecliptic. It's 360 perfect degrees because a circle represented unity. And then they divided everything based off of the equinoxes and solstices into 30-degree little pieces of pie. And at the time, roughly speaking, certain constellations lined up at the beginning of those signs. It has changed vastly. It no longer is like that. That's where we get this huge schism between the tropical and sidereal zodiac. But the Greeks did not form it based off of the stars. They already had anticipated and knew that the zodiac was going to change if they were to attach it to the stars. So what they said to excuse this, they thought that there was different levels of divinity. And unity was number one. It permeates everything. It's kind of like the presence of life itself. We come from it, we return to it, kind of thing. Then they had the gods, then they had the fixed stars. And what they said is that the fixed stars lent their images to the zodiac. And this was to imply that the fixed stars were making talismanic houses for the way less divine planets that were erratic and acted more human-like. And in this way, you could say that your soul, passes from unity down through these spheres, and you're a little piece of talismanic art from the gods. And you're going to vibe with certain stars better, and you're going to vibe with certain planets better. We all have it, right? There's a certain planet that none of us are really into, and it's different for each of us. Like I have a hard time with Mars, even though I have a night chart and Mars rules my ascendant, and it's related to the stars that are in my Purans, right? Because it's very difficult for me. But I really vibe with Saturn, and I have a very Saturnian chart. I have tons of stuff with Saturn. I have parents with Saturn all over the place. And it has a lot to do with the talismanic makeup in my own chart. For you, Kira, you immediately were like, Spica. I want to know everything about Spica because you had that vibe already. It was there. And I know, Oscar, you talk about especially specific stars related to certain celebrities that you've done lots of studies around. We all have a little bit of a vibe going. But it is important to know, like, it's not entirely accurate. It doesn't really matter either. That's not what it was based off of. That wasn't the concept. And what they did is they decided to project them onto the ecliptic for their astrological magic because it stopped being commonplace. Purans used to be common. This Egyptian method used to be common. Ptolemy wrote an entire book on star phases. Some of it's gobbledygook because he assumed the knowledge that you would have as an astrologer. And I'm really grateful to Brady because she brought it back and she was like, we got to figure out how this works because some of this doesn't make any sense. But they did not make it a primary, especially in traditional astrology. They kind of like, we're like, we're going to move further away from this because precession makes these things look less predictable.
Yeah.
And they were very much about trying to see the mundane effects on the planet rather than, I do believe that fixed stars are a lot more spiritual or esoteric in that sense.
Yeah, I agree. And I just wanted to tell like a quick story about like, I mean, it's so beautifully put, like the talismanic part of it and us being like little talismans. And, I come from a village that doesn't have a Spanish name. It kept its original indigenous Lenca name.
That's amazing.
And yeah, and so I've always wondered about the town name. And I finally asked like an elder, and he's like, well, we don't know why, but it translates into River of Scorpions. And so then something just pinged inside of me. And so it made me gather my family charts from my dad's side and finally ask, my grandparents, like everybody. And then I put them into Starlight, and everyone had Scorpio constellation stars as heliacals or just like very prominently in the planet Purans. I mean, it was all over for all of us. Like my Antares heliacal rising grandma, like my Acumen heliacal rising like grandfather, my dad had, another Antares, me, Oculate, like all of us. And all three were showing up. And I was just like, we're all born there. Like, of course, like there's some like relation there to like the land and the place and like
I love that.
Yeah, it was just such a funny translation moment where I was just like, the Spanish burned all those texts, all those libraries. I have no idea what like, indigenous people in that area would have like thought about stars, but I do know that they built their settlements based on the stars, very much like in an Egyptian way. And like, to tie this into procession, like they would really watch it, if like a procession happened, they would move the temple. It was like, if like the temple to a certain deity was at like 40th Street, Nile Street, they would move it up to like 45th Nile Street, kind of like, because the star had had processed, and so we needed to like move the structure, and it has to do with light and stuff like that. And like,
yes.
it even bleeds into Catholicism, right? Like, they would build like Catholic churches, so like the light would come in through the window and shine on the altar of the saint. Like, that's totally part of
Yes.
the star lineage as well, and so yeah, I don't know, it's everywhere, and it's beautiful because
it's been spread all over.
Mhm.
Spread all over. And like the Egyptian thing, the way that the Greeks even got the idea of the fixed stars lending their images, and this, Oscar, is that the Egyptians, when they built their temples, they were to face a specific direction so that the starlight would hit the statue in front of the temple or whatever structure, right? Because they believed the god needed a home. And so they're like, here's your home, Mr. God. And they would make sure that they also did the same thing that your indigenous ancestors did. If things changed, they picked up and moved their entire structures to make sure it was as accurate as humanly possible. And it's very interesting because it's about 500 years before the Egyptian empire really fell. There was a prophet that rolled through and said, when they stop honoring the old gods correctly, that's when this empire will fall. And what happened was they started moving away from those fixed stars. They stopped moving their structures, and sure enough, it fell. Wow. And so it's kind of a remarkable thing to think about. They were basically what we consider to be talismanic magic in the astrological tradition, started with the Egyptians, but it wasn't just the Egyptians doing it. You also see this happening in like Northern European countries with their standing stones. You see this happening down, especially South America. I'm starting to get into it. My best friend, she's actually Peruvian, and she is starting to really get into like the Incans and stuff. There's some great books out there on it. And she sends me stuff all the time related to like the Pleiades were huge to the Incans. And it's found around the world. And that's what I find fascinating. The Chinese were doing it. I'm sure at some point, whenever we stop having an embargo between us and Russia, Americans and Russia, we'll eventually get texts about their esotericism too, because they're so far north,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's also fascinating.
Also like Australia, like some of the oldest monuments that we have to the sky are to the stars. Planets came way much later, but if you go to Australia, like some of the oldest like stone kind of like settlements that we'll see are attuned to star locations. So I mean, it's just like so old.
I love this. Yeah. So earlier, Amaya, you were speaking. You didn't say the term, but you were speaking about the order of the cosmos, or what is it called?
I think it's just the spheres of divinity.
Okay, yeah.
I think that's what it was called, yeah.
And so let's talk about that a little bit. I just want to like give the context for folks. I'm like, I have my astrology books underneath my microphone right now, or else I would pull it out. But talking about the order of the cosmos, or the spheres of divinity. Does either of you have that off the top of your head?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I have it like memorized because I combine the traditional stuff with the parents. But basically you had unity. You could call it the outside sphere, but really it's encompassing all. And I think it's a better way to think of it, because it wasn't like this separate place to them. Then you had the gods. Then you had the fixed stars. Then you had the zodiac, which they said the fixed stars lent their images to. Then you had the planets. Then you had the diamonds, then you had the elements, and then you hit Earth. So you, as a little soul, were said to pass through all these things. And in Hellenistic astrology, at the very moment of your birth, it was like splat, here's that timestamp of when you were born. But in like Egyptian parents, actually they had quite a much larger amount of time that they'd allow for different star phases to come and go, because they didn't feel you got ensouled that quickly. And they felt it was very important to understand the different star phases, because it would give you a map for the timeline of your life, which gets us into like the different phases represent different time periods, and they get activated at different times. Some of them will get preemptively activated with like just transits. But a lot of them, it really does come down to like, I always separate it like youth, prime, and then old age. And then I consider the ones down on the nadir to be Hearthstone. They're kind of affecting you. I almost feel like they're ancestral in a sense. I often find that if I can get someone's family's charts, there's a thread running through the Hearthstone stars, which I'm sure you've noticed as well, Oscar.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes like in consultations, the kind of like little language that I have around it is like, yeah, like in the sky, if the sky is a forest, then kind of like the fixed stars are like the really old trees. And I remember reading about trees and kind of like reading about how like, old trees in a forest will kind of like, pass their nutrients down to the younger trees. And like, there's just like this beautiful relationship in a forest between like trees and age. And I was like, if you have a fixed star shining behind a planet, they're kind of having that relationship of like, the star is like, kind of gonna tap it on the shoulder and be like, here you go, to whatever that theme is. Yeah, I mean, that was just really well put. And like, yeah, their timing techniques of their own, which now that we have this like revival of like Hellenistic astrology, it makes so much sense. We don't get all of our stars like right away, so the way that we separate them has to do with like the star phases, right? The rising Purans are like, the stars of youth, like the culminating Purans are like, when you start your first Saturn return, they kind of will start to light up. And then like the setting stars are like your second Saturn return, you'll get like a new batch. And yeah, the Hearthstone stars, the foundation, it's like, like a sculptor, right? Like, they've made the object out of clay and it's, to their liking, but it's like once you put it into the fire, into the kiln, is that the word, of the oven, you as a sculptor, you kind of have to let it go, and you don't know how that clay that you beautifully meticulously molded, if it's going to crack, if it's going to come out a funky color or shape. But it's like, you don't know, you have to wait. And so the Hearthstone stars for me, yeah, are definitely ancestral and kind of like finding family patterns, but they're also like, the overwhelming themes of a life. So they kind of become like, they're active right away, but it's like maybe when you're 80 or something, you'll look back on them and be like, that's what came out of the oven in terms of them. So
absolutely,
I mean, stars are just so deep, I think it's definitely, for me, absolutely like a higher level of like spirituality when I like talk about them, work with them. I feel
absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. The way I put it for the Hearthstone stars is you may not ever be aware of them, but everybody else around you will. It's kind of like the stories that are told about you after you're dead, which sounds really like mortifying, I'm sure. But I think it's important to think like, what story are you developing throughout your life? Almost like, it's like writing a lifelong poem. Oscar's a poet, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And like, there's a little poem that you're writing from the time you're born to the time you die, and you may not even be aware of it. It's kind of like they've now been able to record that trees and plants can hear each other. They had an experiment back in like the 70s, and they had separated these plants away from each other. And when their roots would move, and we're talking infinitesimal movements, they're so tiny, they could hear it. And they would respond and try to get closer to one another from separate parts of the room. And that's kind of how I see our stories are kind of like, is like there's these little whispers that are happening throughout our life that other people may be more responsive to than we are ourselves. But I do find that once I point out a Hearthstone star to someone, they're like, oh my gosh, I totally see that. But if they were just to go about their day-to-day lives, they may never see it because it's never pointed out to them. They don't know that story is kind of developing and processing in their lives. And I love your use of the tree metaphor. I think it's beautiful, Oscar. I might actually snag that. That's so good.
I do, I'm here to Sag Mark and give like all the like imagery,
So let's talk a little bit about how fixed stars and parents are used in the natal chart. You guys have already kind of gotten into it a little bit, but yeah, like how do you even talk about them, like reading wise?
Yeah, I guess for me, I used to have this rule that now I'm just softening up, because I think the stars are just so much part of my practice that like just even, you know, I have 2 readings on my website, like a birth chart reading where I'm really interested in giving like a nice Hellenistic foundation of a chart with someone and doing that lovingly together. And then like my second tier reading are the Purans. And it's just like, okay, come back and then we'll add the stars in. But now like more and more, like half a year into like really heavy work client wise, I'm just like, I feel weird just looking at a birth chart and not including them, especially because I know they're there. And I'm just like we said, like, and you know, I use the sky map in tandem with the birth chart, right? So like, and that makes it neater, you know. It's like kind of when you put all these objects in a chart, like it can like really like pile up, and like then the degrees you like don't know. So it's like we don't have to do that either, you know. It's like I can have my sky map on the left and the birth chart on the right, and that's how Starlight software works. And it's just like it's so
beautiful
freeing.
Too.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Gorgeous.
And
like it's so much more interesting than just here's your flat chart.
Yeah.
And we get to really roam around, you know, we get to roam around the entire sky. And so, yeah, you know, then it just becomes a conversation. You know, I think we live in a multi-mapping reality. And I think we're not the only ones to know that because of the internet and things like that. But like the ancients knew that, you know. And so it's just part of the conversation that felt very natural to me. And so in client work, you know, depending on the people's across from me's age, you know, meet them where they're at. You know, it's like I also do a Saturn return reading that's just about the Saturn return. And yes, we'll do timings, zodiacal releasing, like all that stuff. But then, you know, the culminating Purans, you can, as an astrologer, give a Saturn return reading with all the usual meat and potatoes. And then, you know, let's look at the culminating Purans, because those are the prime stars that will start to light up around the Saturn return. So it's like that's a huge part of the narrative in the story and what you can expect. And if you can hand that to someone in a Saturn return consultation, like do it, you know. So there's all these ways that they kind of can come in and out, you know. Or, you know, I had a person yesterday who's like into a theater person. I had no idea walking into the consultation, and then I was like, hey, you have a Venus Puran to Alcyone, and you know, Alcyone specifically loves to be in Puran to Venus. It makes someone a poetic soul, like a love of theater, religion, and ritual. And they were like, that's so funny, I'm literally a Shakespeare actor. Wow. So yeah, it's just like, you know, it's also a thing where,
and that's such a specific thing to Alcyone too, like that idea of like taking a tradition and being very like about that tradition and not really straying from it, because Alcyone can be a little dogmatic. So that's such a literal way for that to play out. Thank you for sharing that, Oscar.
Yeah, and it's just like funny moments like that. And it's like, that's one thing that might be helpful for astrologers listening, is like, give the full delineation, the full breadth of like what the star is about in the text, because you just never know. Like, you know, Vendemiatrix, the fixed star in a Virgo constellation, had someone with that with their son, and like they make wine. Like, you know, there's like all these agricultural themes, all the themes that the star have. Like, don't be afraid to just throw them out there, because you never know who you're sitting across from. And I think the fixed stars are not necessarily interested in like ambiguity. Like most times they're kind of like, here we are. And so yeah, you got to give the whole thing, right?
How about you, Amaya? How do you use them?
So I have a separate fixed star reading, and like Oscar, the more that you do fixed star readings, like with the Purans, the more that you don't really want to separate them from your readings, because they can be so informative. And I have a perfect example of that. I had a dear friend and client who came to me, and they had told me they'd gotten several consultations, like traditional astrology consultations, some from some very big names, prominent people in the community. And this person is actually a published author several times over. And anytime someone would look at their normal Hellenistic chart, they'd be like, I don't know how you're a writer. Like, it didn't seem apparent in the nativity until we opened up the Purans. And that is when it was like, oh my gosh, you have literally most of your Purans are either to Mercury or Jupiter throughout the entire session. And almost all of them were about creativity and writing and being prolific. And this person is a prolific writer in like every sense. Even their own esoteric stuff, they also do astrology, came through screaming in their Hearthstone stars, Mercury and apparent to Alcyone. Like, you cannot get any more literal than that. And I think that it can offer a lot of clarity regarding people's like occupations that you may not be able to get from your normal birth chart. And I'm talking, this person we're talking people that helped reconstruct Hellenistic astrology have given this person a reading and could not figure out how they were a writer, how they were successful. And so it was like very interesting to watch it unfold for her, and for her to be like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. And like to give that person that affirmation. My own like technique for doing it, I mean, obviously outside of the technical stuff, I definitely am very big on like, let's make sure this is technically tight, is I usually will sit with someone's chart for about a day with all their Purans. I usually meditate on the stars. I don't just look to the like Egyptian, Greco-Roman stuff, because often they had their own biases, and that's important to note. Like, again, having Algol everywhere in my own chart, and like all there is bad stuff about Algol. And I'm like, I don't think I'm a bad person, right? So I also don't think I'm going to die being beheaded or having a head injury. Like, I've never had a head injury. I did watch someone get a head injury though when I was about 12, and my Jupiter is conjoined by the ecliptic, it's conjoined Algol by like 4 minutes. So like that was a pretty literal way to watch that happen. But otherwise, I've had other things happen related to it. And so it was important for me to go and look into a lot of other cultures and their star lore, because it gave me a much more well-rounded perspective. I also advise, I don't have it down here with me. There's 2 books that I think help philosophically with specifically like the Egyptian Greco-Roman stuff. One of them being Hamlet's Mill. It is prosy and winding and very difficult to read. Highly, highly recommend it. I just barely got the physical version of it. And another one, I love it. It's so good.
It also was really important for Dr. Brady's initial like research was Hamlet's Mill. So that, I mean, it's already part of like, yeah, absolutely. What's the other book? I think that you said too.
And I think the other one, I'm trying to remember the name of it off the top of my head. It's like on Myth and Being, I think is the name. And I'll make sure I'll send you some notes that you can put down in like the YouTube comments, Kira. But it actually contextualizes the myths, first of all, spiritually for the Greeks and the Romans, so that you can understand what was being put into these myths. But also there's some historical information. For example, a lot of these stars, like I always get sad looking like the Nemean lion constellation, because it really was about, it wasn't Hercules just crushing the lion. It was about the Greeks invading different African countries and crushing goddess cultures. And it was the same with Algol. I learned that it was actually a allegory for the Greeks going in and crushing a very specific North African culture and making them submit to Greek culture instead. And they were celebrating a fertility goddess that had snakes for hair. And it was not considered this like horrible being that was going to like curse you for your life. It was considered to be life-giving and precious and very related to, and I love how Brady put it, Mother Earth. And that made so much more sense to me, because when I figured out what my own belief systems were, and that was difficult. Jupiter conjoined Algol is very difficult on a Hellenistic chart, because it really makes you very aware of corruption quickly. It's like you have a magnifying glass for it. It can ruin your faith, because you're constantly just seeing all the things people do that's bullshit, Wow. And yeah, like
describing my ex and you have very similar charts, and he has it in the first house, and I'm like, wow, okay. So
yeah, and then mine's perfectly like sextile my moon. Like, perfectly sextile that moon in the 9th house. So it really is like, do not BS me about spirituality. I will come for your neck. Like, that is my thing. It's my sacred cow. Hey. Do not take advantage of people. Do not take advantage of people with their spirituality. Don't do it. That is not okay. And when I found out, that this was about much more about nature and being in sync with her cycles, and that Mother Nature is not cute and cuddly. If you're an animist, you know this. And a lot of people today just want to see the cute and cuddly side, but like, that's why we have natural disasters. Atolls are amazing, but they make horrific creatures. That's where evolution occurs in real time. Volcanoes are the birthplace of life, and they also will fuck you up. Like, it's just, so like, that is Algol. She is raw, primal, creative power, but she's also very much about like, are you truly honoring at a deep level, that power and where it can take us. And if we're not, she will definitely, I always tell people, if you start working magically with Algol, whatever hubris you have, she is going to cut it out of you with a sharp knife. She will make you really understand what it means to really, truly believe what you believe, and if you're in sync with those things or not. And that's scary for a lot of people. And if you approach it, like I see a lot of people, I'm in the Sphere and Sundry forum, they're like, my neighbor's bothering me. Should I use algal? And my initial reaction is almost always like, try it. Let's see what happens. I don't think she's going to be down with that. She's not really into the pettiness.
Yeah. Well, let's
say that you.
Sorry, I was just going to say, let's like maybe define algal a little bit and talk about like, because I want to get into the stars, some individual stars like we are right now with algal, and algal is definitely one of the most infamous.
Oh God.
So let's talk about that. So algal is when projected onto, is it projected onto the ecliptic, or is it actually part of like that band of stars?
I believe it's projected onto the ecliptic.
Okay.
I don't think it's actually there. Yeah.
Okay. So it's at about 26 degrees Taurus. I'm sure you guys know the minutes, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. I feel like I do, because everyone will, being a fixed star person, every single email is like 26 degrees Taurus algal. And I'm like, okay. It's just like that degree thing that I'll never forget. And like, I mean, this is kind of maybe where there's, I don't know. I only work with Pirans. I don't use degrees. And I think, I agree. Maybe some other people find that resonates. And I know that in astrological magic, it absolutely resonates. But personally, I think philosophically, I just prefer Pirans. So I sometimes have this thing where like, I don't find algal in the Pirans, and so, but it's at that degree. And so I've never talked to anyone about this. So I would actually want to ask Amaya, like, what would you do in that circumstance? Would you be like, yes, you have algal at 26 Taurus to this planet, or
I explain
if you didn't find it in the Pirans?
Yeah, I try to explain, like, in your Hellenistic chart, and I do explain, like, this is a two-dimensional chart.
Like the context.
Flattening. Yeah, I think it's important. Actually, Kara will tell you, the beginning of each session that I do, I spend about 15 minutes at the beginning explaining what Pirans are, the difference between a Perrin's chart and a Hellenistic chart, why we use them together. So I like to use the normal chart, the normal like two-dimensional chart, to help us understand where this is affecting the life, because I think it does get pretty specific. So I kind of combine the two of them together. But I do explain, like, if they don't have a Pirans with it, I'll just be like, it's not a Pirans, but maybe you have a planet that's conjoined, or you might have one of your important lots conjoined, or your nodes conjoined. That I still think does develop in the life, right? Now, I just happen to be one of those weirdos that also has it throughout all of my Pirans. Like, they're Hearthstone stars for me. They're activated in different phases of my life. Very, very prominent in my chart is algal, and a bunch of like really negative stars. Negative in the sense of how they're usually talked about.
Right. So can we quickly, like, let's tell people why algal's considered so negatively, and because the way I know of it, I'm like, oh, that's like the Medusa star. That's the one who, yes, like, cut, like, when people research algal online, they see like, oh, beheadings, like you're gonna lose your head, which can show up in ways of like actually like maybe losing your mind, quote unquote, but doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get beheaded. So yeah, let's talk about algal and sort of like demystify that star a little bit.
I think also it might be just useful in a broader sense. I think, one of the things Dr. Brady says right away in lecture is like, no stars in the sky are evil.
Yes.
So we also have to like totally undo our kind of like Western kind of idea of like good and evil, and like things like that, even start to unpack those things. And like, I see a lot of people every day, and you can't, just like you wouldn't like delineate like one planet and isolate it from the entire chart and say, hey, this dooms you, right? Irresponsible. You can't do that. You wouldn't do that with stars. And, one intense star is not going to doom a nativity, and neither is like a bunch of them. You really have to look at the life in front of you. Like, one of my favorite examples is the filmmaker Dario Argento, right? He makes horror films. He has Alphard as like the Heliacal Rising. He has all these like really intense like stars in the Pirans. And so, I mean, how's that working out, right? Like, he makes horror films. Like, that's like the person in front of you. That's how those stars are like living out. And then, you would tie it back to the Hellenistic chart, and like, yeah, it's just like, you have to do that. You can't divorce the stars from the chart, and you can't like just like isolate them. It's like you have to look at the broader picture of the person, right? And all of their complexity, because people are complex, and I mean, we know that, but I think that's an important thing to know. And I also think, you know, this is like my Vivian Robson kind of part, but like there's also some of the sources online are kind of, you know, you got to know where people are getting their information too.
Yeah.
I think there's like, you know, the Vivian Robson book, you know, Austin Coppock's talked about it, also Brady's talked about it. It's just kind of like very poorly sourced, or there's just like all these like holes in the work. And so, and also just like really unworkable. I actually bought the book because I was just like, what is this? And you know, it'll make
Oh
you,
God.
if it's your entrance to fixed star work, it'll leave you thinking that every star in the sky is evil. I mean, even just
It's
like the
terrifying.
That's how I feel when Googling about the stars too. Like I almost never find, Brady's book was the first, like my first introduction to the stars not being like all doom and gloom and terrible.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's important, right? Like the language that we use out in the world, I mean, like language is magic, you know, like comes from the throat. It's like we're literally, if you can constitute in yourself in language, then like that's a powerful thing. And if you work with language, then you can possibly do things to other people like with language. So I just think the words that we use are so important. And I think like the Robson book just leads people astray because it's just already in this, you know, giving these delineations where it's just like evil. Like I feel like every single star in that book is like causes malfortune, causes illness, causes, and it's just like, where are you getting that? It's so
all the natural disasters and wars, and like it seemed like there was an how do I even put it? Just there was such a focus on everything negative in the world. There's very rarely an example of something good happening. She was very much a doom scrolling kind of astrologer.
Yeah.
So Algol, right? Like Medusa had like snake hair, like, oh, scary, we're gonna get we're gonna get beheaded, right? But what, yeah, I mean, you spoke to it really, really beautifully, Amaya, as like,
well, let's go back to the myth.
Yeah.
Let's understand where this came from. So it did get it was an allegory for imperializing a country. It specifically a North African kind of settlement, and they had been celebrating a fertility goddess that had snakes for hair. And it was actually pretty typical. There was quite a few goddesses in that area that had snakes for hair or were involved with snakes. Like I think about the Mithras and Ariadne. Before she became Ariadne, we know in Greek myth, she had to do with bulls and snakes. And it's very interesting because both the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans kind of dismissed circumpolar stars as being supremely evil because they were all around fertility cults that they didn't agree with. They had much more, the Egyptians were less so, but it's a scale of misogyny, to be quite frank. So like it gets more misogynistic the closer we get to more Roman rule, and it becomes less as we get farther away from it.
Surprise.
It was very much a thing.
Also, very quickly, like Dr. Brady also talks about like how some stars in the sky are associated with goddesses, like, and sometimes those myths, depending on where they're from, are like women in chains. And like I think Brady wrote like even an article about like, you know, unchaining the women in the sky, because like and very much so talking about like how ingrained patriarchy and misogyny is, and sometimes in like these older texts that we're having to face. And like and you know, now is the work too of like amending and kind of talking back.
Yes. Oh, also, I think,
and yeah, I just wanted to add that part too.
Sorry, you froze for me.
Oh, okay.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. Absolutely. It's very important. And that's why I look to other cultures specifically. I've started really branching out and getting other myths and getting deeper into why. I think that's why that on being and myth is so important, because it went far beyond. For example, we see again, snakes used to be considered specifically an object of wisdom or a being of wisdom. It could be poison, but it could also be medicine. And that's something I always tell my clients whenever we see Algol or Alphard come up in the chart. I'm like, it can either be poison or medicine. I have done both. I am a very Algolian kind of person, and I have specifically words. It was interesting. I was thinking about this little side note here. Did you know that if we don't have a word for something, we literally can't see it? They've done experiments on this in indigenous cultures. If they don't have a word for a color, they don't see the color. And I mean, literally, they won't be able to identify it. It's black and white to them. So yes, they are magic. They very much affect our consciousness and what we're able to see. So when we say things like, oh, you have algol in the chart, and there's already meaning attached to it, it is going to terrify someone. And I always try to remind them, first of all, a lot of these delineations, they were not very pro-women. In fact, you'll find very few female constellations that are positive, like the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, were also not very positive to the ancients, unless you look at astrological magic. And so, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on here that was determined by the culture of that time. You have to look to other sources. What helped me with this was seeing Brady's talking about, you know, Mother Nature in particular, really connected, figuring out that I was an animist, not any particular, we could say tradition or practice, but that I thought the world was alive and we're in relation with it at all times, whether we're talking to a tree, an animal, or things that are unseen. And that made sense to me because I've always had a hard time with fitting into a box with my faith, and that would be Jupiter in a conjunction with Algol, but also having it as a Hearthstone star. Algol essentially is Medusa. The myth goes that, and there's a few different versions as it goes with all Greek myths, but essentially Neptune wanted to have sex with Athena. Athena kept spurning him, so he went into her temple and he raped Medusa, her most beautiful maiden, and desecrated her temple. Now, this is where you can see that Athena was also a product of that misogyny at that time. She was in with the guys. She doesn't punish Neptune or try to go against him. She punishes Medusa. And don't let anyone tell you it was a savior thing. It wasn't, because there were other Gorgons that existed, and they were immortal, so they could live for the rest of their lives. She specifically made sure that Medusa was the only immortal Gorgon, so that she could be killed. It was not about protecting Medusa. It was absolutely about Athena's rage. And in this sense, I believe that Algol is about having righteous anger over the loss of innocence, but innocence in a very broad spectrum, not just talking about literal virginity, not just talking about children, but I also think about, again, that conflation with Mother Nature. Right now, our planet is dying. And what we're seeing with all the stuff, especially, I'm very, very interested to see what happens when Uranus gets to that 26-degree point.
Yeah.
Wow.
And eclipses, which start next year, we get an eclipse on Algol.
Yes. November. In November,
yeah, it's the day after my birthday, so. Because my son is exactly opposite Algol. Yeah.
Yes. You know, and I do think that it is about, you know, we have misused Mother Earth. And there is a real thing coming up from the depths, in a sense. Gaia was forced by Uranus to hold monsters inside of herself. And it wasn't until Kronos came and freed them that they were allowed to actually exist. And there is a purpose for apex predators. There is a purpose for things that scare us. I think it's interesting, you know, I talked to children today. They're absolutely terrified of any insect. None of them are fascinated. They're all terrified. But when I was a kid, you know, I was running around like picking up stuff off the ground. And I was like, look at the cool beetle I found. And it was no big deal. And I think about how our perspective of nature has changed because we've created gilded cages for ourselves. And Algol is the primal essence of getting out of that cage, getting actually in communion with nature directly, or with the world around us directly. And it is about also freeing your own primal senses and instincts, so that you know when it is time to be righteously angry. Now, if you approach Algol in the incorrect way, you will very much lose your head. I'm in a daily Algol practice. I don't lose my head. I do get righteous anger. It does help my anger come forward better. I have Mars in Taurus. It doesn't want to come forward at all. And it's become a lot louder since I've started to work with Algol, but that's not a bad thing. Anger is not bad inherently. It has a purpose.
I you know, I have Algol to my Saturn in a Puran, and my Saturn's in Aquarius in a day chart right in my first house. So I also have this star connection, and I think it is about righteous anger, and it is a star about justice, you know. And I think when I have Algol clients, you know, the specificities, right, to planet, but there is kind of this kind of like, just like you're built to be in like crisis situations and like really know what to do. It's like the mark of a crisis worker, someone who's gonna stand in the middle of the storm also, and like, you know, be ready for it, and like in service to others, in service to like other people who are marginalized, and like understanding power structures, and like understanding when they're fucked up, you know, as they often are, and like not standing down, you know. And I think an algal person also embraces like all the colors in the crayon box of like emotion, you know. It's just like I wouldn't want to be happy 24/7. It's like I understand that my rage is important, my sadness, all the shades of emotions that I feel, I embrace wholeheartedly. And kind of you know, we need them. Like, and you know, to add to what Amaya is saying, like, yeah, rage is important because rage is our body being like, this is unacceptable, or like this is dangerous, or it's like, you know, a refusal of like these systems. Like I get enraged when I see the news. I get enraged when, and it's my body telling me that something is wrong and that something must shift. And if rage can be a constructive emotion like that to kind of push us into the new thing, then yeah, of course we need it, you know.
Absolutely.
Such
Mhm.
a
Absolutely.
good. Sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say that's such a good thing to hear during this Mars retrograde as well.
Oh God, we need it, don't we?
Yeah.
And I also think it's important. The end of that myth is that then Perseus is trying to recover his lost love. He goes to Athena asking for help. And Athena says, go get me the head of Medusa. So she is asleep. She does not fight Perseus. This fictionalized version you see in TV and movies, she does not fight against Perseus actively. She's actually sleeping. He sneaks up on her, uses his mirrored shield so that if she wakes up, she'll see herself and she'll be turned to stone. And he cuts her head off. So this whole thing is Medusa is constantly a victim in every single one of these stances. And I do find people who have a very prominent algal in their chart, as well as like Acumen, Aculeus, and a few others, tend to have gone through some really tough shit. And that's why they tend to have that deep sense of, like, for me, I grew up in a culty religious kind of thing. And so I am very sensitive to it. And when I see it happening where someone is either utilizing their power within a spiritual community incorrectly, or they are taking advantage of people, or they're grifters, it makes me intensely enraged because my parents were taken. Our entire childhood was flavored by this bullshit. And so I just don't want to see other people have that happen to them. And I do find that I think about how Joan of Arc had a serious parent with, you know, algal, and she needed to have a battle. In fact, when she stopped having to battle, it caused her issues. She needed to find something to do. Also, I find that algal people tend to be outside of the binary. They don't tend to stick within the lines. You know, I don't talk a lot about my own sexuality, but I definitely don't consider myself straight. You know, I have 2 partners. I'm in a 3-person relationship for 7 years. It's a serious one. And that's another thing that comes up a lot with people who have, you know, the algal's parents or the conjunctions in their chart, is they tend to kind of march their own drumbeat and they do not care what other people think. Because they're like, you know what, you live once. I'm not here to make you happy. I'm here to make me happy. And I also battle to make myself happy. I want a better, more equitable world. I want to protect people against, you know, the loss of their innocence. I don't think that you should have to regret being naive about something. Naivety is beautiful. It means that you have not been touched yet. And in a sense of like, no one has ruined something for you. And if I could keep people from having that happen to them, I would, because I think that's valuable.
Would having my sun opposite algal, like, would that be a sort of parent, or like, I'm curious. I have my sun's at 25-55 Scorpio. And I'm curious because it never came up in
actually pull up your parents. I don't think you had it in a parent.
Okay.
Yeah, because remember we're going from sunrise to sunrise,
right?
And noticing, right, like visually out in the plane, and like noticing when the stars and planets are meeting at a very tight orb of on their pivot points, right? Culminating, descending, rising, like those kind of points. So it's just so different, right? It's than how aspects even work,
right?
You know?
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, I mean, I figured because I feel like it would have come up in a reading before.
Yeah, I'm just gonna get my dog. He's barking. Yeah. I'm just gonna.
Go ahead.
I'll be right back.
No problem. Okay, so we talked about algal quite a bit, which I'm really happy about because I feel like there needs to be some, you know, major reclaiming around that star. But I would love to talk about the royal stars because those are the ones that I am most aware of. And I think those are kind of like, you know, people get excited. I get excited when I see them in someone's chart. So yeah, do you guys just someone want to run through is it 4? It's 4, right? Yeah, the 4 royal stars.
You have Regulus, Fomalhaut, Antares, and Aldebaran.
And where are they, like, if we're projecting onto the ecliptic?
Regulus is at 1 degree Virgo.
Is it 1? I thought it was 0. Is it 1 at this point, or is it
actually
0?
It's almost 1. It's not quite there yet.
Okay.
I just kind of keep an orb within the 1st degree.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember the rest of them because I think Antares and Aldebaran are both at about, I think it's like 15 degrees and they oppose one another in Gemini and Sagittarius.
I thought they were at like 9.
They might be at 9. It's not the same as parents, so like
right. No, yeah. So I think they're at 9 because I remember the eclipse coming up November 30th is like very much on top of those. That's at like 8 degrees. 8 and some change. So yeah, I think that
we can actually look it up. There's a little cheat that I like to use. I put in fixed star degrees and astrology, obviously, and it gives me Astrology King has a list, and that's often what I do when I'm right before a consultation if I just want to take a quick preview. But let's take a look really quick here. I'm almost certain that you're right though. Yeah, it's at about 9 degrees 47 minutes.
Okay.
So there's that. And then Fomalhaut is at 5-6 degrees Pisces.
Cool.
So they were considered the points where the equinoxes and solstices were occurring at the change of the seasons at one point.
Okay.
No longer. That does not happen anymore because of precession. But that's why, especially the Persians, attached so much importance to them, was because, you had Regulus rising when we had the summer solstice happening. And then you would have Antares when we had the fall equinox. And then you would have Fomalhaut for the winter solstice. And then you'd have Aldebaran for spring. It's no longer like that, but they're also extremely bright. And that was the thing that they really noticed, is that these were very, very bright stars that were heliacally rising before the sun. So, which we should probably define that.
Yeah.
A little late in the conversation, but we should do that.
Yeah. Anyone, Oscar, do you want to do that?
In terms of like brightness, I mean, I guess the thing that's popping into my head immediately is like, just through doing client work, I can actually at this point kind of echo what Dr. Brady thinks of, like, even dim stars have an impact. And kind of like if you were to approach fixed star work and only look at like a certain magnitude of like brightness, and then like not the other ones that are kind of more on the dim side, I feel like you would be losing a lot. I feel like, the fixed stars, they're there, and so the way I've seen them play out in my consultations are, I haven't been really interested in kind of separating them by that, but of course, if they're brighter, they tend to mean things. I'm thinking about Sirius, right, the brightest star in the sky, and the Egyptians would like see Sirius and then know that the Nile would flood. So they kind of have these sort of things associated to them. I don't know, Amaya, you're probably gonna have better things to say about
no, that's not brightness. True. You have great things.
Don't but
be
yeah,
silly.
I don't know. My mind's going blank on the brightness thing, so I gotta need help.
Well, with heliacal rising, it just means that it's rising on the eastern horizon before the sun. And then with the setting, same thing's going on. It's setting before the sun, and it's visible. So that's important. Like the visibility, like with all ancient kind of astrologies, visibility was a big part of it. And that's why brightness used to matter so much. Now, they couldn't detect dim stars as easily as we can now with all of our telescopes and stuff, which is awesome for us, because this is something I love about like astrological magic. They just stuck with what was easily available to them, which means that there's so much room for us to innovate today using those same techniques. So that's pretty exciting because we have so many more stars to work with. And that gives us a lot of different flavors and things. As far as brightness and magnitude are concerned, I think that it was important to the ancients, mostly because it was more visible. Visibility was such a key part of both that, Babylonian, Egyptian, Greco-Roman kind of astrology. Even the Incans, like I said, my friend is learning and kind of sharing with me. They also were very big on how bright a star was. We got really technical exact about it in today's world, because now we have like a magnitude scale to show like how bright it is. I'm actually in the same line as Oscar. The thing that I always like to remember about the fixed stars, and this is, I think, a very important point, we actually retroactively attempt to describe fixed stars utilizing planetary significations. but they are considered a higher form of divinity. And my thought on this is that it's easier for us to conceive of the planets. They are closer to us. We have a better, more direct relationship with them. And fixed stars are much more broad, and it's much harder to understand something that I loved how you're talking about. There's multiplicity here. It makes me think of Disney versus Studio Ghibli. Disney is very clear. It's like black and white. Someone's good, someone's bad. There's, a very clear story arc. But with Studio Ghibli, I always think about how, like, my favorite was Princess Mononoke, and the villain in it, Lady Eboshi, is not pure evil. She wants to kill the forest god, so you're thinking, God, that's bad. But she then employs prostitutes and lepers in her colony and gives them jobs and dignity and power. So she's not just one purely evil person, and she's dimensional. And that's something I enjoy about those films, but it's also what I enjoy about stars. Stars are not like this clearly binary, this is good, this is bad. They were described in very stark terms. You have to remember that especially the Greco-Romans, they were very influenced by the philosophy of their time. And they were very much about like, accept your fate. So they would look for the worst case scenario so that if something better happened, it's a happy surprise. But if something bad happens, you're prepared and you can meet it face on. The problem is in today's world, especially, that can be really scary to hear like, oh, you might lose your head, or in the case of like the Pleiades, you might go blind. What if the blindness isn't literal though? What if it's more like you become so stuck on something with Alcyone and so narrow and like dogmatic and tunnel visioned that you don't see the other things around you? It's not about literal blindness, right? So it's a very important distinction to make, is like this idea of brightness, if it's likely rising or not. It was all about vision. And it was bigger than a binary, always bigger than a binary.
I wanted to ask real quick. So just to clarify, because I think you might have said it wrong, not wrong, but like, I think you might have made, and I just wanted to clarify. So helically rising means the star rising before the sunrise, so that you can actually see it. And then setting would be stars setting after the sun, correct? Or is it setting before the sun?
Heliacal just means sunrise. So
but for the setting, like for helically set, is that a thing?
That's the star that was setting as the sun was rising.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I totally misdefined that.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
No, I'm glad we clarified that. Okay, so when the sun,
very important clarification.
When the sun is setting,
big one.
What star is rising as the sun is setting?
Got it. And maybe we should talk about, because when I start my consultations with the Star Program session, that's where I lead in, are the heliacal rising and setting pair. That's kind of where I begin. Maybe we should open that up. And just to say another thing about brightness, now that it's finally it clicked in my Sag brain, I just had to wait for the lightning to strike, is there's also ways to know which Purans are a little bit more like turned on, like angularity. Like, if you're a Hellenistic astrologer, you look for planets in the 1st, 7th, 10th. That's just to get your brain. But like with stars, if it's a Puran that's circumpolar, I'm going to pay attention to that star a little bit more. If the star is in the phase where it's arising and lying hidden, I'm going to notice that. There are different star phases. They're a little bit more intense than others, and so you'll kind of like feel them like more of in a like an intense way. So that will lead me through the Puran list. Also just noting
let's
star phase.
Yeah, let's actually back up and define that a little bit for everyone. We're not gonna be able to like do a masterclass on this, obviously, but okay, so we now know helically rising, it's before the sun. Helically setting, it's setting before the sun. Then we have these different star phases. Circumpolar just means that it never technically is rising or setting. It's just kind of what we consider to be rotating around the poles. So for the Egyptians, these were gods that they called them the immortals, the realm of the immortals. They just did not care about us because they never touched the earth. They never had that kind of empathic ability that a god who did touch the earth would. And then you have a rising lying hidden. Technically the star is actually rising, but because of the earth's tilt, it's just hovering below the horizon, which kind of freaked the ancients out because they were like, where is this star? It's supposed to be coming up right now. So they consider that to almost, it's like almost bringing in a Hearthstone kind of feel, so it intensifies, right? Hearthstone stars are always affecting you throughout your entire life. And then Gosh, my brain just went blank. What is the other one, Oscar?
Circumpolar, correct?
No, we did circumpolar, a rising lying hidden. There's that
there
last
is one more condition. Yeah, there is one more condition.
My brain literally just went blank. We're experts here, really.
Hey,
I know it's so much to keep in your
brain.
Curtailed passage. Yes.
Curtailed passage is when it's actually kind of just barely hovering above the horizon and it doesn't seem to be moving, which also freaked them out because they're like, this is supposed to be culminating and it's not. So that's also intense, right? Because it's kind of just sitting in this phase for a predetermined amount of time, which they figured out eventually. They figured out the math for it. But when it first emerged, it was very freaky to them. It's kind of like eclipses freak the ancients out.
Yeah.
They're like the sun or the moon just disappeared and it got eaten, right? Well, for them, not having the stars rise predictably like that kind of freaked them out. And with circumpolar stars, for the Egyptians particularly, they just didn't want you to be celebrating the fertility gods of like the Babylonians, Sumerians, Mithraians that were around them. So they were just like, not those ones. Those ones don't count. So what they believed is that you have your heliacally rising star. That is like the theme for your life. I call it like the theme for your book, the book title. It gives you like an overall theme. Then you have your heliacal setting star. And that's a gift that this god that has traveled to the circumpolar region or the immortals has then brought back down to you. And it usually affects your vocation or your overall direction in life. If you lean into it, you tend to feel very satisfied with what you're doing in life. If you don't, then you'll be pretty keenly aware. Rising star parents, those are stars that basically up until your Saturn return, they're activated. Some are much more activated than others. As Oscar has pointed out, there's certain conditions we can look at, you know, if they're in one of these special phases, or if they're circumpolar, or if they're really like bright in magnitude, I tend to pay attention a little bit more because the brighter it is, the easier it is to see. The ones that have culminated parents, those are the prime years. So basically from around 30 to 60. And then the ones that are setting are the stars of your latter years. So this is 60 plus. Most of us don't live past that. If you did, you'd actually enter like your full Hearthstone stars. But for the most part, the Hearthstone stars are defining your life subtly throughout the entire life. And that gives you just a basic breakdown. Some are going to be way more emphasized than others. Especially you have to look at that Hellenistic, you know, kind of two-dimensional chart and say, if a star is like angular and the planet is also angular in the chart, you'll probably see it a lot more clearly in your life. Versus say you have, let's say something in like the 12th where it's not quite angular, it's already hidden to you and it's in a pairing with a star. It might be a little bit more obscure to you. You might not actually feel its effects or really see how it's playing out in your life as clearly as say like one that's in the 1st or the 10th, right?
Yeah. Like,
did I miss anything, like, Oscar?
No, that's exactly what I would say. And I like, yeah, that's an important point too, is like, you know, we have essential dignity. Like, for example, like my Jupiter is my Almuten, and it's also like in the 10th house angular in Scorpio, and it's my benefic of Sect. So that immediately would like make me look for if I had any Parans to Jupiter with stars. And those are actually like really, for when I saw those, they were like, yeah, duh. So yeah, sometimes like the Parans, you can see kind of how quiet the star's influence is by kind of using those kind of techniques as well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and like the heliacal rising star, absolutely. I always it's kind of like the horizon people are kind of chasing throughout their life. And like it's also the star that people will kind of like weave their philosophies around. When I write my fixed star essays that I've started doing in the last couple of weeks, like I mostly like choose people who have that certain star as a heliacal rising or setting because it's just so obvious. You know, it's like Sofia Coppola, heliacal rising Auresha is like, I make period piece films, but like with like, I don't know, like these post-punk soundtracks, right? Like the Auresha thing of like tying the sacred knot, tying things together that like other people aren't tying together. You know, it's just like, you'll see that in a native's life, like really like play out really loudly. And it's something that they're always kind of like looking at the horizon at. And, you know, the setting star, the heliacal setting star is kind of like the other star of that conversation where it's just like, this is how we get there, is that kind of vibe, you know. And I think they kind of play off each other. And the heliacal setting star, it's said to come from your daimon, right? I'm just starting medieval astrology studies, but like, yeah, the spirit in the chart, or just like thinking that, you know, there's this thought that it comes from your soul, you know, at the nativity, you know, it's like a gift, you know, they're both gifts. And so, yeah, it's kind of like if I lean into my Capella Heliacal Rising, Heliacal setting, it's like, it's only going to make my Oculaeus Rising Star like more fleshed out. It's like they're having this convo together. Mm-hmm.
And I love that for you, because I just like put that together. It always makes me think of the tarot card, the Chariot, because it is the Chariot, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And yeah, when you act from your instincts in that kind of free way, you really see like effort and your poetry and stuff, and that just comes alive for you. And then I remember watching you were live tweeting about like entering a poetry contest, and you did it like at the last minute, which I totally expect of Capella.
Yeah.
And then you ended up getting the fellowship with it.
Oh yeah, it was like
ta-da. You're like, I'm just gonna throw this out there and maybe I'll get it or maybe I won't. But that's such a Capella thing to do, is just be like, well, I better hop on this chariot before it leaves me.
Yeah,
and you totally leaned into it. And I love watching that play out. It's especially interesting because I've done so many charts for people in our community, to like watch them now tweeting and be like, oh, look at that star activation.
So let's go back to talking a little bit about the specific stars. I want to kind of run through the royal stars and just kind of throw out some, like, why are they royal? I mean, we kind of talked about it a little bit, and then maybe talk about one or two other stars, maybe your favorite stars, and then we can kind of close out and talk about like how people would even go about learning about this. So yeah, let's talk about the royal stars again. Like, let's start with Regulus, the royalist. In my opinion, I mean, that's kind of how I've seen it though. Like,
that's how they considered it too.
Yeah. Regulus, it's in the constellation Leo, correct?
Yes.
No longer.
No longer. Okay.
I mean, like, if we're defining it by what we consider to be Leo, which is a zodiacal thing, no, it's actually just barely going into Virgo. But at the time, it was.
No, it's just in the like actual constellation though, not like the zodiac.
It would be considered part of the Lion constellation.
Yes, the Lion constellation. Yes, thank you. And it's what, the heart of the lion or the head of the lion?
It's the heart.
Okay, the heart of the lion, which makes sense. The heart of the lion,
and then
being a royal star.
The other stars in that constellation are Zosma and the back of the lion star, and then Denebola, the tail of the lion. Okay. And I think also through procession, the tail's kind of fallen off the lion.
Okay.
But yeah, you know, it's cool.
Yeah.
I have a Denebola Mars Paran, so I feel like
I think I have Zosma Jupiter, I believe.
Ooh, Angel of Mercy. That, I don't know why that's like in my.
It really does.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, tell us a little bit about Regulus. Like, what makes it so, like, how does it tend to show up in people's charts? And we can, you know, we have a very famous example of a Regulus person who is the current president of the United States, number 45, has Regulus conjunct his ascendant.
Yeah, you know, we're talking about power, you know, we're talking about power and privilege and our relationship to that. You know, one of the most exciting people that I came across this, they have their Heliacal setting star Regulus is this South Korean rapper from BTS. And, you know, he released a song called Digita, which is kind of like the King's music, and it's a rap song, and if you watch the music video, it's really like him beheading himself. And it's like all these like really trippy things about like being famous and this persona and this, his relationship to his kingship. And it's kind of like a song about patricide. And I was just like, this is so interesting that Regulus is your Heliacal setting star, and your title track from your new album is literally about like deconstructing what regality means. And I was just like, oh wow, Suga's really doing this in the music. And you know, I've also plugged in Donald Trump's birth data into my Starlight against my will, just because I was just like, Christ,
you gotta see it. You gotta see what's going on.
And so I wouldn't say that, you know, it's in Paran to his ascendant. I would say, but it does have it to, I believe, his sun and Mars, and they're set off by timing. And it's kind of interesting because, you know, at this point he would have had all his batch of stars kind of light up. And so yeah, there's this Regulus Sun Mars thing, and like I remember like following the story of when he got sick and stuff, and I was just like, oh, like what's gonna happen? Because one thing about the four royal stars is they kind of come with also like conditions, of like are the downfall of like the gifts that they give. And I was just, I don't know, I'm still curious because I'm just like, you're definitely not acting righteous,
Right.
So when is that Regulus moment coming? I don't know.
I've been thinking that for a long time too. When is that Regulus moment coming? Yeah, what are you gonna say?
It'll come at some point. It'll come at some point. I think it's important to note that like royalty in the way that we conceive of it today is not how it was conceived of. You used to have to go through trials to become a royal. And that's really what you have to think about with these royal stars, is that they each have their own lessons and trials that the native has to go through. They're all held to a much higher level of behavior. Each one is very unique, but they all kind of cross over. So for Regulus, you cannot act out of revenge. So I'm interested to see what happens, because of how the only way he's been able to attack Biden has been to go to Biden's son. And, in a very hypocritical way, because all the things he's accusing Biden of doing for his son is stuff that he does for his family every day. There's also a real thing, and I find this is very true for people who have very prominent Regulus parents, or even conjunctions, is that people do not have the same amount of empathy for them as they do other people. So like someone who's got a really prominent Regulus Paran, they'll go and they'll post something on Twitter. Maybe they're just having a bad day and they just don't get the responses that they're wanting. In fact, they're more likely to get attacked than they are to get the support that they want. And so it's very important to know, like with especially like Regulus, you need to have a good inner circle that you can go to for this sort of stuff, because going out into the public, you're already seen at a very almost like pedestal level, and which is so unfair, but that's just reality.
Yeah.
And you need to be aware of that pedestal pretty much at all times, because if you act against that nature, that star, it tends to have dire consequences. Dire being very subjective, right? Some people can't handle being criticized. And one of the things I always remember for Regulus in particular is like, if a king went around beheading every person who disagreed with him, he wouldn't have a kingdom.
Yeah.
He would have a riot, which is kind of what's happening, right? Like, there's a lot of rioting going on. So like that's specific to Regulus, is like, you cannot act from revenge. It will backfire. It'll backfire epically. And here's the thing, you'll either be famous or you'll be infamous. There's really no in between, no matter what, you are in the spotlight. And that's a lot of pressure to have on a native, but it can also bring brilliance and success and lots of like publicity. Today, we don't really have royals, we have celebrities, and we literally have, the celebrity royalty sitting in our White House at the moment.
Yeah. And also, unpacking what kingship is in like our century, right? Like, that you can be famous in a room and you can be famous like as a celebrity. There's different levels of like being well known. And so, you just kind of have to, when someone comes to you as a client, you just had to be, conscious of that and being like, okay, like when you step into the room, maybe like this is playing out. Regulus for me is tied to my node, so it becomes what we call a vocational star. And so it's the whole like pressure. I mean, the people will feel that kind of pressure of like, I can't slip up in public because everyone's watching. And it's just like there's some self-conscious kind of like Regulus thing, I think, that people have sometimes. It's just like wanting to be your best, and
there's an immense amount of pressure.
One of my best friends has a stellium conjunct Regulus. It's like her sun's conjunct Regulus, and then she has Jupiter, Mercury, and Venus all within like 4 degrees of that, all in the 10th house. And so much pressure on herself all the time, but she does have that very like regal sort of glow to her. Like she feels so I don't know, she feels very royal in that way, and she's just herself. Like she's not she's not royal, but she's one of my definitely my favorite Regulus. She's my best friend, so my favorite Regulus person that I know. Let's talk a little bit about, let's see, we don't have a ton of time left, so I don't want to go through all the royals, but maybe Aldebaran, since we're having an eclipse conjunct Aldebaran in less than a month.
Yeah, when you brought up Aldebaran before, it like pinged in my brain, and I was like, keep it.
Yeah.
Mercury, keep it Mercury. You know, one of the things that's written about Aldebaran is this phrase, like, all exchanges are sacred. And I think that's really beautiful, especially now, right? We're living in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of like uprisings that of course should be happening. Like, it's high time like something happens to this scale. And like, just thinking about like one of the words of 2020 that has just been inescapable was like mutual aid.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. And like if every exchange is sacred, right? Like, how can we tap into that? And like, if that's part of the eclipse that's coming up, then like, you know, it might just be prominent. You know, like Uranus and Taurus is already giving us this kind of like you know, complete like shifting around things, where I think like what's radical is actually showing up. You know, I think that's the big Uranus and Taurus thing, is like being like showing up and like being in community. And I think with Aldebaran, it's like, okay, how are we exchanging in ways that are actively antagonistic and against capitalist structures? You know, like, what does care look like? You know, strategies of care, networks of care that kind of like are not interested in like this kind of like neo-colonial exchange of capital, right? And like, how can we foster those things? And I think Aldebaran is definitely, you know, it was a star of commerce, but I think we can open it up and just see it as like, you know, this kind of exchanging also, you know. That's my Aldebaran moment.
I love that so much.
Actually,
thank you.
That's so true too, because I just wanted to confirm before I opened my mouth and put my foot in it. You know, Aldebaran was connected to the ancient god Mithra, and he was a battle god. And he was very much about like, there is a specific rule of battle. And they were very particular about that. You fought honorably or you did not fight at all. And that's kind of where I think that idea of like being in communion with one another is an act of resistance, because it is about righteous relationship. And that's what this was about. Even if you were going to fight someone to this god, you were going to fight with honor towards them and towards yourself. And what we're seeing right now, especially with the eclipse probably getting ready to conjoin it, is like, was this truly honorable? And I think we all know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I think we all know the answer to that.
Yeah.
So
wow. Beautiful.
It really is. It's really interesting, a very interesting star. We could go on forever about it, honestly.
But you know, there is that thing about like the fine print of the royal stars, and like for Aldebaran, it is like integrity. And honesty, and bending your principles. You know, Aldebaran will not be happy if you're bending your principles, like doing all kind of shady things, like loopholes. Like, it wants you to stand in integrity and honor, and it's a huge part of that star.
Yes, and it's the hardest lesson, because I find people who have these stars, they learn the hard way. We all learn the hard way, but they especially learn hard because it's so public. Each of these stars, again, it comes back to, you're going to be famous or you're going to be infamous. Yeah. And you know, you learn the hard way because maybe you thought you could just tell a white lie and it blows up epically in your face. And it's like, no, these are people, especially with that Mercury Perrin, they will be blunt, but they're going to be very honest with you. You can trust them for what they're about to tell you. And I actually have quite a few friends who have that parent, which is wonderful. And also, like, for my little Cancer moon heart, I'm like, you're killing me. Please be nicer. But they're like, no, this is the blunt truth. And they end up becoming trusted for that. That's what ends up being their calling card if they lean into it. If they don't, they become infamous for just never telling the truth.
Can't help but think about our friend Zach, who has his
I love
him. Zach Powell has his Mars conjunct Aldebaran in the first house, and yes, everything you just said spoke to that. All right, I really quickly, I have a call in 10 minutes. That's why I'm like rushing us through this, or else I would seriously talk to you guys about this for another hour. But I want to quickly talk about Altair, because we have the Saturn Jupiter conjunction happening December 21st at 0 Aquarius. Altair is really close by at 1, I think it's at 142 Aquarius, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I want to talk about Altair since that's kind of it's been on my mind. That's where Saturn stationed earlier this year. And I've been watching it in the sky, like Saturn, Jupiter, and you look up a little bit and you can see Altair. So yeah, do you guys have thoughts about Altair as the star, and then perhaps maybe with this great conjunction happening on it might be about?
I mean, it's kind of like associated, it's got all these like militaristic associations sometimes in certain texts, like it's the eagle. I'm gonna step into Moon Altair Paran as soon as my Saturn return starts in a couple weeks. So I'll know a lot more about it in the next 3 years. But kind of like already like having to kind of embrace like a bold, daring attitude, and kind of like the 12th house sun makes me want to like be shy and kind of like, but I've been constantly being put in front of like, you're here, like step up to the mic, step up to and like being very daring to be seen. So I don't know, it is a star about courage, I think. And so if we're thinking about this conjunction, like we're gonna definitely need courage and whatever however the election goes. I think whoever wins, we have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of like one thing that people keep saying is like staying with the good trouble, right? Like the Donna Haraway quote, or just like things I'm seeing on social media of people being like, okay, like the people always rise, and that takes a lot of like courage and like gusto, right? And we have to do it.
Yeah, I know it's in the constellation, is it called Aquila?
Aquila, yeah.
Aquila, which is an eagle. Yeah. Maya, your thoughts about it?
So it's actually one of my Hearthstone stars, and my sun is conjoined it to almost the exact minute as well.
Ooh. So we have Saturn Sun conjunction then.
Yes, it's gonna be so fun. I would say that yes, boldness is a big theme there. Knowing what your values are very important here, because it can become very dogmatic. It is a battle star. The eagle was associated with battle because it was considered to be, and it still is. It's an apex predator, and so my personal worry is on a very broad scale. That is the herald for war, right? Especially dogmatic war. And that's what we're seeing right now, is that the country in America is split in half, and it's more polarized than it's been in a very, very long time, probably since the civil rights movement first began. And seeing both Jupiter and Saturn there is kind of like, plus on top of it, having to worry about the eclipse right before. Was this really an equitable election followed by this conjunction? It does make me wonder, what that's going to mean militaristically for us, because it is a battle star and it wants a fight. I know that personally. Again, I have a lot of battle stars in my my parents, as well as like in my normal Hellenistic chart. And if I don't have a mission to go after, it just runs havoc with my life. And I believe it's the same when it comes to like the mundane stuff, is like, if you don't give certain stars a very specific aim, they need to do what they do. That's their nature. And they're going to do it one way or another. So that would be my only worry. But on the flip side, I do agree with Oscar, like the resistance that can happen here. It's a very stubborn star, like one of the most, I actually am a very shy person. I just went through a bunch of theatrical training as a kid, but I like being alone. I spend a lot of time by myself. I'm very quiet at home, and my sun rules my midheaven. And so when I'm in public, I can seem like I'm a very alive person, right? But in private, I'm a very docile, quiet, laid back kind of person. And I think that the fixed star Altair has a lot more to do with it than actually having a midheaven in Leo, because that wouldn't matter if my sun was further along in Aquarius. And I think having that boldness is going to be key. Hopefully with it being about like Saturn and Jupiter is about fellowship, and Saturn is about structure. And I hope that brings about some really good resistance movements where people are trying to come together as a community. And hopefully a few really good leaders that's the other thing. It's very original. It wants to do what it wants to do. And regardless of whether or not it's popular or normal or has ever been done before, it's going to boldly go where no one's gone before. And again, that can both be a good and a bad thing depending on what happens. So I think it'll be an interesting time for us all, but I hope that we can all take hope and say, where are we going to put that energy in our own lives? Because we can worry about the mundane. I have a third house stellium, so I'm very much about like, what can we do with this? And I'm like, okay, I can't really affect if we have a corrupt political election. I can go do my part and, vote and hopefully get the word out, but that's it. If it's corrupt, it's corrupt. What I can do is I can gather together with my family and my friends and my community and make sure that we're taking care of one another, that we're not letting, fascist bullshit happen around us. And we are doing our part to resist it. And also know that loving and being together with one another is resistance. It is bold. It's an act to say, a huge act, even to find people who are on other sides of the aisle and finding ways of connecting with them. Because right now that schism is actually what's driving this country into possible, civil war. If it keeps going down this road, that's almost inevitable in my opinion. So if we can all just find ways, like, how do we reach across the aisle? How do we actually find ways of working together that are radical? It is radical to put aside your differences and try to figure out how to get along.
Hell yeah. As we
that would be my hope.
This. Yeah. It's a nice.
I definitely feel Altair in the room.
Yeah.
Like Amaya's really like channeling that for me. And I'm inspired because like Altair to Moon, it's like also like I'm gonna be looking for like bravery in other people and like getting excited about it and making it part of my lunar stuff. And I don't know, it's just great. I'm feeling it.
Oh, I love that. Thank you.
Well, with that, let's start to close out. We mentioned a couple of books, and I'm going to link all of them down below.
I've got a list.
Okay, good. Thank you. I will be emailing you about that list. But what's like the best route to go about learning if people listening want to learn more about fixed stars and parents?
Brady, you have to get her lectures.
Yeah.
I mean, like her books are really cool, but I don't feel like you can learn parents really without having her lectures and seeing it. It is very visual. Wouldn't you say, Oscar?
Yes, I agree. Like the way I think about her published books are that they're supplementary to the lecture. And she says that herself. And like, really like you need Starlight software at a certain point, maybe, just because then you'll start to really see the visuals of it. And the lectures do that. And, if anybody wants to start dipping their toes, astro.com is actually a free way to pull up Parans. You go into the special menu tab, and it's under Brady Parans. It's like the first one.
Yes.
And so, yeah, everyone can pull up their Parans immediately. I'm like switching between both pronunciations because they're both fun. And so, yeah, people can automatically, do that step on astro.com and get that list. And now we've talked a little bit, kind of scratching the surface of like what that list classifications kind of mean, on the surface. But yeah, that's already a place to start, learning, just seeing those star names, I think does so much at the beginning. It'll make you excited. It'll make you be like, wow, there's more here,
And it may explain things that you've never been able to explain before.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the most, like for me, it was very surprising, like to see actually most of the conjunctions in my chart end up being parents as well. And that was like really rewarding. Whereas some people you're going to find like, I see this star conjunction, but it doesn't really speak to me. And then you find out it's not in your parents. So it's probably not going to. A conjunction will only be as strong as the technical aptitude behind it. So, I think it's a really valuable start. Definitely go to astro.com. And then if you want to get deep, get her class. If you just want general, like simple delineations, honestly, your best money spent is on star and planet combinations.
Cool.
That's like
the other one. Yeah, I think this has the better delineations in it. Whereas like Brady's book of fixed stars is way more technical. And
yeah, I've had a hard time with it. I want to get the other one.
This will actually give you your like delineations, like basic delineation. She also gives you examples you can study, which I think is very valuable. So every delineation has like a person, like we could go to Fosse's and go to Perrin with the Sun. We have Nostradamus had Fosse's and a Perrin with the Sun, like, so it gives you people you can study.
Yeah. And that's also part of like these essays that I'm writing over at my coffee account is like, I felt like the star and planet combination book was amazing. And in the sense that it gives you one person, which each planet star Paran combination. But I was just like, Sag midheaven, Sag stuff. And so, yeah, I collect example charts all the time. And you'll see in the essay, we talk about like 4 or 5 people examples who have a relationship to that star. And it's about, because I think once you see that star and kind of like out in the world and actually like living and breathing amongst people, it also helps like that delineation become just more fleshed out. And so that's kind of what I'm interested is like maybe these like broad stroke themes of the stars, but like just giving more examples of like, hey, look at this person, look at that person, look at this person doing it this way.
Man, I'm gonna have to go and like sign up for that now.
Yeah, I mean they're also free to read, you know, just like, you know, I wanted to make it accessible.
You need to be paid. You need to be paid for your work. Don't be silly.
So let's thank you both so much for nerding out together and letting me witness your fixed stars nerd out. It's been truly like a pleasure. Tell the people where they can find you, Amaya.
I am Feral Vinifica on Twitter. I don't always talk about astrology because I feel like some of us are a little too obsessed with it, but you'll find lots of like nature pictures, and sometimes I do threads on the stars. And then heartwarriorpath.com if you want to get a reading.
Awesome. And Oscar.
Yeah, on Twitter, Cielo Suelo Astro. And so cielo just means sky, heavens in Spanish. So Cielo. And then suelo means ground. So Suelo, and then astro. And then my website, if you want to get a reading, it's cielosueloastrology.com. And you can find me there.
Awesome. And we will link below. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is so great.
This is a lot of fun. Thank you for having us, Kira.
Yes, thank you.